Welcome to Journals of Self-Discovery. Hello and welcome to this month's edition of Journals of Spiritual Discovery. It's been a couple months since our last episode, and I just wanted to thank all of you who've purchased my book over the last couple months. And also to encourage you to please leave a review on Amazon if you haven't already. Leaving a review is really helpful to other people who are thinking about making a purchase. So all you have to do is go to the Your Order page on Amazon. You find the book, and then you click Write a Product Review. If you haven't read the book, please check it out. It's called Subtraction, the Simple Math of Enlightenment. And as one Amazon reviewer said, it's a true story of spiritual journey packed with wisdom. I hate writing reviews, so I'll keep it simple. Highly recommend it. Also of note, the TAT Foundation August workshop will be here before you know what happened. Beyond Imagination is the title, and it will feature Jenny Clark, Norio Kushi, and Sean Pethel. All of these are people it would be worth your time to meet. And that will happen August 17th through the 19th, and you can check out tatfoundation.org and look for the banner on the front page. So there you have it in terms of the marketing for this month. Now, I have one of my favorite poets as a guest. I've read several of Pattiann Rogers' poems at TAT meetings and retreats, and I think that they're an aid to deepening the atmosphere or calling forth a mood of profundity. I hope you find the same effect in our interview, which begins with Pattiann reading several poems that she chose just for this audience.
I'm going to read a first poem that's titled Achieving Perspective. Maybe many of you are familiar with a sentence by Walt Whitman. I hear and behold God in every object, yet understand God not in the least. That's something I keep in mind because that's the experience I'm having. I see and hear God in everything, but understand nothing about it, nothing about God. Anyway, so some of my poems are focused on what does seem particularly miraculous or amazing to me. And this poem is about one of those things. Achieving perspective. Straight up away from this road, away from the fitted particles of frost coating the hull of each chickpea, and the stiff archer bug making its way in the morning dark, tow hair by tow hair, up the stem of the trillium. Straight up through the sky, above this road right now, the galaxies of the Cygnus A cluster are colliding with each other in a massive swarm of interpenetrating and exploding catastrophes. I try to remember that. And even in the gold and purple pretense of evening, I make myself remember that it would take 40,000 years, full of gathering into leaf and dropping, full of pulp splitting and the hard wrinkling of seed, of the rising up of wood fibers and the disintegration of forests, of this lake disappearing completely in the bodies of toad slush and duckweed rock. 40,000 years and the fastest thing we own to reach the one star nearest to us. And when you speak to me like this, I try to remember that the wood and cement walls of this room are being swept away now, molecule by molecule, in a slow and steady wind, and nothing at all separates our bodies from the vast emptiness expanding. And I know we are sitting in our chairs, discoursing in the middle of the blackness of space. And when you look at me, I try to recall that at this moment, somewhere millions of miles beyond the dimness of the sun, the comet Bela, speeding in its rocks and ices, is just beginning to enter the widest arc of its elliptical turn. The next poem is titled, In Addition to Faith, Hope, and Charity. This is a poem I wrote because I like to try to make a perfect poem and then assume that it proves something. In addition to faith, hope, and charity, I'm sure there's a God in favor of drums. Consider their pervasiveness, the thump, thump, and slide of waves on a stretched height of beach, the rising beat and slap of their crests against shore baffles, the rapping of otters cracking mollusks with stones, woodpeckers' beak banging, the beaver's whack of his tail paddle, the ape playing the bam of his own chest, the million tickering rolls of rain off the flat leaves and razor rims of the forest. And we know the noise of our own inventions, snare and kettle, bongo, conga, big bass, toy tin, timbrels, tambourine, tom-tom. But the heart must be the most pervasive drum of all. Imagine hearing all together every tinny snare of every heartbeat in every jumping mouse and harvest mouse, sagebrush vole and leash shrew living across the prairie, and add to that cacophony the individual staccato tickings inside all gnatcatchers, kingbirds, kestrels, rock doves, pine warblers crisscrossing each other in the sky, the sound of their beatings overlapping with the singular hammerings of the hearts of cougar, coyote, weasel, badger, pronghorn, the ponderous bass of the black bear, and on deserts, too, all the knackings, the flutterings inside wart snakes, whiptails, racers and sidewinders, earless lizards, cactus owls, plus the clamors undersea, slow booming in the breasts of beluga and bowhead, uniform rappings in a passing school of cod or bib, the thitterings of bat rays and needlefish. Imagine the earth carrying this continuous din, this multifarious festival of pulsing thuds, stutters, and drummings, wheeling on and on across the universe. This must be proof of a power existing somewhere, definitely in favor of such a racket. After living 29 years in Missouri, where I was almost constantly inside hardwood forests, under trees, we moved to Texas, outside of Houston, and that was the first time I'd actually been where I could see a wide, wide plain. We were out at the edge of the urban and suburbans. And the first time I ever saw the moon actually rising out of the horizon. And at night, that night sky coming right down on the earth, nothing between us and the sky. And we lived across from a field, and I knew there were mice in that field. And so this is a poem about one particular mouse in the field across from our house. The title is Being Accomplished. Balancing on her haunches, the mouse can accomplish certain things with her hands. She can pull the hull from a barley seed in paper-like pieces the size of threads. She can turn and turn a crumb to create smaller motes the size of her mouth. She can burrow in sand and grasp one single crystal grain in both of her hands. A quarter of a dried pea can fill her palm. She can hold the earless, eyeless head of her furless baby and push it to her teat. The hollow of its mouth must feel like the invisible confluence sucking continually deep inside a pink flower. And the mouse is compelled to see everything. Her hand held up against the night sky can scarcely hide Venus or Polaris or even a corner of the crescent moon. It can cover only a fraction of the blue moth's wing. Its shadow could never bar or blot enough of the evening to matter. Imagine the mouse, with her spider-sized hands, holding to a branch of dead hawthorn in the middle of the winter field tonight. Picture the night pressing in around those hands, forced simply by their presence to fit its great black bulk exactly around every hair and every pin-like nail, forced to outline perfectly every needle-thin bone without crushing one, to carry its immensity right up to the precise boundary of flesh but no farther. Think how the heavy weight of infinity, expanding outward in all directions forever, is forced, nevertheless, to mold itself right here and now to every peculiarity of those appendages. And even the mind, capable of engulfing the night sky, capable of enclosing infinity, capable of surrounding itself inside any contemplation, has been obliged for this moment to accommodate the least grasp of that mouse, the dot of her knuckle, the accomplishment of her slightest intent. Maybe some of you listening have had an experience that I have occasionally, not often, and never anticipated, and that is to suddenly sense something near that is not my senses can't detect, and yet it's a presence of some sort, and it's not scary, and it doesn't seem mystical. It seemed very natural, actually. So I've written a couple of 3 poems trying to evoke this feeling. So this is one of those poems. The title is The Background Beyond the Background. On an autumn afternoon, perhaps selecting apples from a crate, or examining pickled beets and onions in a jar, or watching 2 honeybees at one red clover, we stand unaware before a background of behest and sanctity. Or floating down a river through elm and cottonwood shadows, past sandbar willows and lines of turtles on sunning logs, over underwater thickets, bottom beds of leaf roughage and mud, we are all the while made finely distinct upon a more distant background of singularity. Anywhere we turn, this background stays, a domain for mortal and immortal, for crystal grids, for shifting furls of smoke, for structure and fallibility, for each nexus of sword and cross. Atop a barn roof, a glossy green-tailed rooster with auburn feathers lifts his wings against a backdrop of dawn. Is it the passing moment of occupied event, or the passing fact of barnyard morning that creates the impression of presence before this silk of elusive light behind light? Like a clear horizon at the edge of a wide field, the background beyond the background of sky reveals most explicitly the figures of those that come before it, elephant or ostrich or seed-heavy grasses, saint, sow, runt or sire, summer lightning, blowing ice. It achieves us all. Far, far beyond those far mountains of stone and cavern against which I am outlined now, there is another background, translucent, stolid, eloquent, still. Since I am sure of one thing, that we are born ignorant and we will die ignorant, the world is a great, great mystery. And part of the pleasure of living is confronting that mystery. And part of that confronting is questioning. This is and I do begin many of my poems but with a question. And this is one of those. And I ask myself, what is the greatest gift we're given out of the many gifts we're given when we're born? And the title of the poem is The Greatest Grandeur. Some say it's the reptilian dance of the purple-tongued Sangoana, for there the magnificent translation of tenacity into bone and grace occurs. And some declare it to be an expansive desert, solid rust-orange rock like dusk captured on earth in stone, simply for the perfect contrast it provides to the blue-gray ridge of rain in the distant hills. Some claim the harmonics of shifting electron rings to be most rare, and some the complex motion of 7 sandpipers bisecting the arcs and pitches of come and retreat over the mounting hayfield. Others for grandeur choose the terror of lightning peals on prairies, or the tall collapsing cathedrals of stormy seas, because there they feel dwarfed and appropriately helpless. Others select the serenity of that ceiling cellar of stars they see at night on placid lakes, because there they feel assured and universally magnanimous. But it is the dark emptiness contained in every next moment that seems to me the most singularly glorious gift, that void which one is free to fill with processions of men bearing burning cedar knots, or with parades of blue horses belled and ribboned and stepping sideways, with tumbling white-faced mimes or companies of black-robed choristers, to fill simply with hammered silver teapots or kiln-dried crockery, tangerine and almond custards, polonaises, polkas, whittling sticks, wailing walls. That space, large enough to hold all invented blasphemies and pieties, 10,000 definitions of God, and more, never fully filled, never. At one point in my writing years, I wanted to honor every living creature that I could. Of course, that was not possible, but that's the kind of goal you want that you can never reach. So this poem arose out of that wish, and this is a poem about it is dedicated to all, let me say, all one-cell creatures. The title is Address, the Archaeans, One-Cell Creatures. Although most are totally naked and too scant for even the slightest color, and although they have no voice that I've ever heard for cry or song, they are, nevertheless, more than mirage, more than hallucination, more than falsehood. They have confronted sulfuric boiling black sea bottoms and stayed, held on under 10 tons of polar ice, established themselves in dense salts and acids, survived eating metal ions. They are more committed than oblivion, more prolific than stars. Far too ancient for scripture, each one bears in its one cell, one text, the first whit of alpha, the first jot of bearing, beneath the riling sun, the first nourishing of self. Too lavish for saints, too trifling for baptism, they have existed throughout, never gaining girth enough to hold a firm hope of salvation. Too meager in heart for compassion, too lean for tears, less in substance than sacrifice. Not one has ever carried a cross anywhere, and not one of their trillions has ever been given a tombstone. I've never noticed a lessening of light in the ceasing of any one of them. They are more mutable than mere breathing and vanishing, more mysterious than resurrection, too minimal for death. You know, most poems that have lasted have not had a single subject. Most poems that people repeat and want to reread contain several subjects, all working at the same time, if they were masters of poetry. And I'm not saying I'm a master of poetry, but I try to do that. I try to have several things taking place in a poem, and this poem is one that I think where that happens a little bit. I hope so anyway. The title of this is Hail Spirit. A weaver, this spider. She plays her 8 thin black legs and their needle-nailed toes across the threads, faster, more precisely than a harpist at concert can pluck the strings in pizzicato. Although blind at night, she nevertheless fastens a thread to a branch of chokecherry on one side of the path, links it to a limb of shining sumac opposite, latches the scaffold to ground stone and brace of rooted grasses, and the structure takes dimension. Skittering upside down across and around, she hooks the hooks, knots the widening spirals, the tightened radii, orbs and hubs, bridges and bridgeheads. We can never hear the music she makes as she plucks her silk strings with all the toes and spurs and tarsal tufts of her 8 legs at once. She performs the reading of her soul. Oh, remember how vital her eyes, the eyes of her gut, eyes of her touch, gauging the tension, her eyes of gravity and balance, of purpose, steady eyes of reckoning. Don't miss the moment when she drops, a quick grasp, catches, swings forward again, an artiste. She expands the sky, her completed grid a gamble, a ploy played on the night. The silk is still, translucent and aerial, hanging in a glint of half-moon. The work is her heart, strung on its tethers, ravenous, abiding. Well, I wouldn't be a poet if I didn't have a few poems about death. So I usually like to try to take, Emily Dickinson says, write the poem at a slant. I like to take a new slant on something that people use in a common way and maybe think of it in a slightly different way. The title of this poem is The Consequences of Death. You might previously have thought each death just a single loss. But when a plain gray titmouse dies, what plunges simultaneously and disappears too are all the oak juniper woodlands, the streamside cottonwoods, every elderberry bush, and high spring growth of sprouted oak, once held inside its eye. And when a sugar pine splits, breaks to the ground, falling with its fiestas and commemorations of blue-green needles, long-winged seeds, the sweet resin of its heartwood, there's another collapse coincident, a fast inward sinking and sucking back to nothing of all those stars once kept in its core, those clusters of suns and shining dusts once resonant in the sky of its rigid bark and coned scales. We could hear the sound of that galactic collapse as well, if we had the proper ears for it. And when a mountain sheep stumbles, plummets, catapulting, skull pine, from cliff side to crumbling rock below, a like flame, shape of flame and intensity, on a similar sharp ledge on the other side of the same moment, out of our sense, loses balance, goes blind. Because of these torn paper shreds of gold-lashed wings, this spangled fritillary's death, somewhere behind the night, a convinced declaration of air and matter and intentioned, silenced, speaks no longer of the God of its structure. We use the word God to mean just about anything. And so I have written poems where I use the word God. And sometimes I gave it some human characteristics, and I used the pronoun he, because I didn't want the poem to be interrupted by other kinds of concerns. And so maybe you'll go along with me on this one, whether it's your thinking about the word God or not. But I hope you do. The title of this is The Possible Suffering of a God During Creation. You know, it's my idea, because we live in a world that's in flux all the time. It's a dynamic, living universe, Earth that we see erupting in volcanoes, and things are changing all the time. It makes me think the creation's not finished. And so I took that view with this poem. The possible suffering of a God during creation. It might be continuous, the despair he experiences over the imperfection of the unfinished, the weaving body of the imprisoned moonfish, for instance, whose invisible arms in the mid-waters of the deep sea are not yet free, or the velvet blue vervain, whose grainy tongue will not move to speak, or the ear of the spitting spider, still oblivious to sound. It might be pervasive, the anguish he feels over the falling away of everything that the duration of the creation must, of necessity, demand. Maybe feeling the break of each and every russet-headed grass collapsing under winter ice, or feeling the split of each dried and brittle yellow wing of the sycamore as it falls from the branch. Maybe he winces at each particle by particle disintegration of the limestone ledge into the crevasse, and the resulting compulsion of the crevasse to rise grain by grain, obliterating itself. And maybe he suffers from the suffering inherent to the transitory, feeling grief himself for the grief of shattered beaches, disembodied bones and claws, twisted squid, piles of ripped and tangled, uprooted turtles and rock crabs and Jonah crabs, sandbugs, seaweed, and kelp. How can he stand to comprehend the hard, pitiful, unrelenting cycles of coitus, ovipositors, sperm and zygotes, the repeated unions and disillusions over and over, the constant tenacious burying and covering and hiding and nesting, the furious nurturing of eggs, the bright breaking forth, and the inevitable cold blowing away. Think of the million dried stems of decaying dragonflies, the thousand leathery cavities of old toads, the mounds of cows' teeth, the tufts of torn fur, the contorted eyes, the broken feet, the rank bloated odors, the fecund brown-haired mildews that are the residue of his process. How can he tolerate knowing there is nothing else here on earth as bright and salty as blood spilled in the open? Maybe he wakes periodically at night, wiping away the tears he doesn't know he has cried in his sleep, not having had time yet to tell himself precisely how it is he must mourn, not having had time yet to elicit from his creation its invention of his own solace. That line from Walt Whitman about hearing and beholding God in every object, yet understanding God not in the least. After a while, that makes me angry. I think, why can't I? And this poem arose kind of out of that mild anger and frustration, I guess. The title of it is Goddamn Theology. It was easier when you were a jonquil and I was a fingertip pressed at the juncture of your radiating petals and stiff stem. And it was not so difficult when I was a Persian guitar, and you were the knee on which I lay, my neck held easily in your hand. But there were problems when you were 200 years of years, twisted like taffy, twisted and looped like a dry bristlecone in dusty snow, and I was just a beginning sliver of clear tadpole breath in a whorl of waterweed. I didn't know what to say. And when I thought I knew your name, and I called it out loud many times, that's when you were a deaf sheaf of catacombed coral with more than one title and no tongue. I was whole, a burning ball of peach hanging from a branch. You were multiple, sparks struck from a hammer against rock. I split into a showering orbit of mayflies in the evening sun. You congealed into a seeded cow patty in the field. When the painted pony and I were galloping fast through rabid waves on the beach, there you were, a tiny spire of ship sailing off the edge of the sea. The night I woke in white, my body moon-gray, you were curled, a black hump of quilt at the foot of my bed, dead asleep. And later, when you were falling rapidly, heavily, raindrops and pock-drops and bullet marks, a mob in the mountain lake, I was precise, wing and talon over the prairie, jackknifing and stabbing, lifting the mouse by her spine. When I was crying and truly sorry, you were a spray of chartreuse and scarlet tinfoil confetti on my head. That's when I knew for certain it was going to be much more difficult than we'd ever imagined before. This is my last poem. Another one when I kind of examine the idea of God again in another way. And the title of it is Inside God's Eye. As if his eye had no boundaries, at night all the heavens are visible there. The stars drift and hesitate inside that sphere like white seeds sinking in a still dark lake. Spirals of brilliance, they float silently and slowly, deeper and deeper into the possible expansion of his acuity. And within that watching, illumination like the moon is uncovered petal by petal as a passing cloud clears the open white flowers of the shining summer plum. Inside God's eye, light spreads as afternoon spreads, accepting the complications of water burr and chestnut, the efforts of digger bee and cuckoo bee. Even the barest light gathers and concentrates there like a ray of morning, reaching the thinnest nerve of a fairy shrimp at the center of a pond. And like evening, light bends inside the walls of God's eye to make sky-wide globes of fuchsia and orange, violet-tipped branches and violet-tinged wings set against a red dusk. Lines from the tangle of dodder, bindweed, and honeysuckle, from the interweaving knot of seaweed and cones, patterns from the network of blowing shadow and flashing poplar, fill and define the inner surface moment of his retina. And we are the only point of reversal inside his eye, the only point of light that turns back on itself, and by that turning saves time from infinity and saves motion from obscurity. We are the vessel and the blood and the pulse he sees as he sees the eye watching the vision inside his eye in the perfect mirror held constantly before his face.
First thing, I just wanted to thank you so much for doing that. I mean, it felt like I was listening to a symphony in a way.
No, that's a wonderful compliment.
You know, you kind of, a couple of times, you kind of gently guided me towards this idea of just let me read my poems, and that would be the best way to do this. And now I understand why you didn't want me asking questions and so forth during the reading.
Well, yeah, we could have done it. We could have done it that way, but the problem is, I can't say what I want to say any better than I say it in the poem. You know, if I try to speak in prose about the poetry, it's never right. So, kind of leaves me dissatisfied. So, anyway.
Absolutely, yeah, I understand. Well, I was hoping that perhaps steering away from commenting on the poetry, perhaps I could ask a few questions just about you, perhaps, and your life as a poet.
Okay.
So I was curious if you have a spiritual practice like prayer or meditation, or really your work, your poetry is that spiritual practice.
It is. In fact, it's I wrote a little bit about this in a essay book called my essay book called "The Dream of the Marsh Wren," that creating the poems that were creating me. They were, building the soul, my soul, the one I wanted, the one I couldn't be all the time. And so I call that reciprocal creation. That it's something that's circular while I'm writing and focusing totally on the work and how it sounds. You know, you said that about the poem sounding like a symphony, which is a wonderful compliment to a poet, because that's the major difference between poetry and prose. One of the major differences, that when I'm writing poetry, I'm singing. When I write prose, I'm talking. And there's all the difference in the world in how you can use the language to make the music you need. And sometimes the music itself can direct you to the words you need. Sometimes I would leave a blank space not knowing what word was right, but I would know where the accents and the unaccented syllables would fall in that right word. I mean, that is a kind of sounds mysterious, but it's got something to do with the body, because it's the body that reacts so forcefully to music. You know, that enters the music. The body is listening to. It reacts to it, and so I would pay a lot of attention to how my body was reacting to what words, their cadence and their sounds I was placing on the paper or now in the computer.
So that I would have, when my children were old enough to go to school, I could have some pretty established for myself a very, very quiet place, undisturbed. And I was friendly with my neighbors, but not so friendly that we dropped into each other's house without any preparation, without contacting each other first. And so I would have a time, and it was a pretty total immersion in the work of writing the poem, and what were many drafts of these poems would go through 30, 40 rewritings until it seemed right, the music was right, and I knew when the music was bumpy and off kilter that I had not gotten the right words. So anyway, that's the answer to it. Those were my meditations and my prayers, I used to call them.
Do you feel like in your many years as a poet, have you made progress in terms of being able to connect to that feeling or have a clear bead on that feeling, or is it just as ephemeral as it always was?
I went through a period, I had some definite things I wanted to do with poetry, but at the same time, and I would tell my students this: don't hold the reins too tight, because don't try to guide everything that's happening, because sometimes that mistake or that word that gets in there that you didn't even know the meaning of it will be the exact thing you need. And but one of my goals that I wanted to do was that when I first started writing, there was a pretty big break between science and art, thinking they had no relation with one another, and they were even antagonistic a little bit, an antagonistic relationship. But I was thrilled with science. I took astronomy course as an undergraduate, and I was just thrilled with what we knew about things so far from us, and how it had a sense, for me, a sense of liberation, that the human mind was able not to conquer it, but to be aware of what's going on around us in the universe. And of course, the Hubble Space Telescope just expanded that even more. That what a magnificent universe we live in, and also down to the quantum area, and it's always more mysterious. The scientists are the first ones to say we don't know. We're just trying to understand with our poor tools, our math, our clunky language, to have some sense of where we are and what's going on around us with the lives of other beings and the stars. And people used to be afraid when there was a meteor shower that God was punishing the earth or something. Anyway, they've just liberated us with these marvelous kind of stories about how an egg develops, what is happening with each step, and how in the world did that come about? Over millions of years developing. It's just, in fact, one of my favorite quotes is from Stephen Jay Gould, who is a scientist, and this was from his book, The Structure of Evolutionary Theory. And this is another thing. Not every scientist, all of us have different religious experiences or experiences of the spirit. But many scientists do have a sense of a religious experience when they're looking at something carefully enough, how it unfolds, the story. And can I read this? You don't have to include it if you don't want to, but it's very short.
Sure.
This actually one sentence, but a pretty long sentence. So this is Stephen Jay Gould speaking. And he starts it out. Something almost unspeakably holy, I don't know how else to say this, underlines our discovery and confirmation of the actual details that made our world, and also, in realms of contingency, assured the minutiae of its construction in the manner we know, and not in any one of a trillion other ways, nearly all of which would not have included the evolution of a scribe to record the beauty, the cruelty, the fascination, and the mystery. So I love that, because you know what he's saying. I'm sure you get the gist of this whole thing. That the way evolution has formed our world has resulted in a scribe that can record the beauty, the cruelty, the fascination, and the mystery. And that's what I wanted to do. It's exactly what I wanted to do. And because I felt that. I felt the beauty, the cruelty, the fascination, and the mystery of where we live, knowing we're never going to understand it. It's like Whitman's seeing God and everything, but understanding God not in the least. We don't have the capability to do it. But anyway, that's one quote from a scientist, and he used the word holy. You know, in his work, he sees the holy, the holiness of it. And I don't know. Anyway, that's one thing I wanted to do, definitely. But my work led other ways too that I didn't anticipate, and I did let that go. And some of my poems are just purely celebrations. They're, celebrations of life, and songs. They're songs. And Keats said, "The poetry of earth is ceasing never." And that's the music of it, I think. And I've wanted to express that music that is present in the earth and the universe, and to find a place of habitation for our souls in poetry, through poetry. Anyway, I think that's a very long answer to your wonderful question.
No, I appreciate it very much. And in terms of your work today, do you have a sense of the poetry that you're writing today? Is there a particular goal for that? Is there something that you're working on now that's different, say, than when you started 30 or 40 years ago?
That's another very good question. I guess, yes, I am 78 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And my first book was published in 1981. And so, I was working toward that in 1970, toward that first book. Because
Mm-hmm.
people don't really why would they have a knowledge of what kind of work goes into producing work in energy, I mean, too, because you can't see it being done. You can see a basketball player practicing, you can see a violinist practicing, you can see a dancer practicing, you can hear a lot of human skills. You can visibly see what a person is doing to perfect them, but you don't see it when any kind of writer. You can even see an artist, painter, gaining skills, learning, and a teacher teaching. And that's something you just don't perceive someone, unless you're involved in it yourself. You kind of miss the effort. Tiring. It can be tiring. And I have 14 books. I don't think my work is. I don't think I have the same level of energy that it takes to be entirely original. To say something you've never heard said before. And that's what poetry, one of the goals of poetry, is to expand the use of the language, I think, because, we're just kind of like in a cave feeling our way along and trying to make a path, and part of the light that helps us is language. And so the best poetry opens avenues of thought and does it. I'm talking about the best poets, the poets that write poetry that is lasting, or people go back to and have a place in the culture, have affected the culture, to make our perceptions and our insights wider and deeper than before. And so I don't know. It's hard for me. I can't duplicate my past work. I can't do that. That would be one shade lighter, I would say. One wouldn't be nearly as well. I can't do it. And then often I will think, oh, I think I want to write about this, but I think, oh, I've already written about that, or it kind of dampens my enthusiasm a little bit. And and like I said, it's tiring. I will continue writing because I have to. I have to do it. It's the way I've identified part of who I am. I'm also a mother and a grandmother, but one of the things that has been permanent since my teenage years has been the writing side of my life, and so I can't let it alone, and I just have to have some kind of faith that it might be of value to somebody. I don't know. I don't know that I'll ever have another book. I just published this last one last year, and it takes at least 4 or 5 years between books to get a collection of poems that I would feel confident publishing it. But I will write nevertheless, even if I don't publish.
I've been reading some of your earlier interviews and other people's opinion of your work. There's definitely the thought that you broke ground in terms of this interface of science and poetry. Do you feel like there are other poets who have stepped through that opening that you made and are carrying on with that tradition?
I do. I get things from books to people want an endorsement, of their book, and so I have some in touch with some of those poets. I think that some of them have gone in a slightly different direction than I did, but I think, and I do think there are more poems that give a science reference in some way, in some tangential way sometimes. But, the bulk of the poetry written during the years I was writing, and even into this time, people, readers of poetry, are looking for a little narrative, some kind of a little story within the poem. And I think when I first started writing, the poets were very self-absorbed, with confessional poetry, and a lot of the personal pronoun I appeared. And I know when my first book was published, it was published by Princeton University Press, and it was reviewed a couple of 3 places. One was in Poetry magazine, or that journal, that old journal that's been around for a long time. The reviewer, I wrote, in fact, the first poem I wrote where I thought that I had accomplished part of what I was aiming to do, because when I was in college, had a minor in zoology and worked with a professor who was doing research on frog eggs. And we went out at night one night and tagged bullfrogs in order to come back and catch them and see if they'd changed ponds or moved around. It was something about moving around, whether frogs were moving around. Anyway, I wrote a poem about the development of a frog egg and combined it with this experience of being out at night in the forest, not catching frogs, but just describing those eggs that were in the pond and what was happening to them and what was going on around them in the forest. And anyway, that was in my first book, and this reviewer said if I wanted to know all that, I'd read Scientific American. So I thought I had succeeded in lifting, combining those 2 things, the experience of the night in the forest, and I did more than that. I described the moment. You can see it now in films, when the first heart begins. And what happened in that second, in that moment, how everything was different. Here was a life that was now subject to death. There hadn't been anything before that, but just a spray of blood vessels, but no beating heart. And that still moves me, that thought of, what, and I called it a whole language had been created or something. I can't remember now the exact words I used, and he missed that. The reviewer missed that part of it, that it had I asked myself when I was writing this, what does this knowledge mean to the human soul? This knowledge of the development of this frog egg, which would eventually be a creature. And then that I tried to come to some kind of to me it was it had a meaning for the human soul, just like learning about the sky and how vast this universe is and how many different things are in it, and how they operate, and how we can sense them to a certain degree with our 5 senses. And anyway, that was my first poem, and I remember taking it to my husband and saying, I think I finally learned how to do this. And I did follow the model of that poem, because the poem has to be musical, and it also has to evoke in the reader an emotional response, so that it can be felt. That's one reason you can't verbalize it, or it would be like trying to explain music.
Mm-hmm.
You can't. You have a wonderful reaction. Music can make people cry or laugh, and yet you can't really explain why or how, but it does. And so it's the same with poetry. The music helps that evoking of a real response that's physical. It's in the body. Just like in the music is in the body. It's felt in the body. Have you done? You've done a lot of interviews. I did go to your website and listen to the review you recommended, or the interview you recommended.
Oh, with Jerry Winstrom. Yeah, he's a very interesting fellow. Definitely, to me, he's very much that nexus of spirituality and creativity, which is always there, but people don't necessarily articulate it the way that he has.
No, it's hard to do, even if you're the creator of it. My brother was an artist, a visual artist, and he had a teacher once who told him, and I don't know if this is generally held by artists or teachers either, he told him that any square 1 inch square of your canvas should be interesting. And I heard something similar about a poem, which I do believe and which I have used in my writing, that every line should be interesting. And I even taken out of the poem, it should have an interesting word or an interesting combination of words, or all of the crafts of poetry can be used, any of them, alliteration or assonance or hyperbole, or not any of those terms, but it should be interesting in some way. And I tell my students that, because if it's something that the reader can close their eyes and go to sleep on, it shouldn't be in the poem.
I was curious, one thing that I have done many times with people is those who are interested in spiritual practices and so forth, I've encouraged them to find a creative practice, because I really believe that, like you said, your work is your meditation or your prayer. And I feel like the creative process is a different slant on the spiritual search or the spiritual inquiry. I was curious if there was any advice that you might give a person who was interested in exploring that creative side of themselves, if there was any sort of general advice that you give to your students, perhaps, that helps them get in touch with that side of themselves.
Well, I would say, first of all, you have to be interested in what it is you're going to begin to be creative with. Maybe you're interested with pottery or something, but it has to be something, I think, that you have an interest in, a curiosity, maybe, just curiosity about something. The major fault I find with writers, poets, is they don't understand how hard the work is. They think, they come in as a novice thinking that somehow they're going to be inspired, and all of this is because a poem that they read looks like it was easy to write, and because it took a lot of work to make that look easy. I mean, poets write about that. Yeats writes about that, how we stitch and stitch and stitch, and the seam is invisible. Putting the poem together is getting everything in the right place with the right rhythm and the right cadence and the right definition. And of the words and stuff. Anyway, they get frustrated because they think, well, I can't do this. No, you can't. Did you ever know of a person who wanted to play the piano sit down and be frustrated they can't play Chopin or Beethoven? You have to start and practice just exactly like anybody learning to do something physically. You have to practice, and you have to be able to take suggestions from a coach or a teacher or someone who has experience in whatever field it is that you're interested in. Even sports analogies are always available. But people playing a sport will all the time refer to the fact that he knew he couldn't miss the basket. He got into some kind of a rhythm and knew that he was going to make 3-pointers for the next 5 minutes or whatever. But the rhythm of the body and what's going on, you have to make a connection, and it has to happen with writing too. Even though anybody looking at you thinks you're not doing anything, you're staring out the window. But there are mental things going on, and those mental things have to result in the body reacting. We make that wrong dichotomy between the physical and the mental, but it's all one thing, and you can be concentrating, and all of a sudden, you're thinking, and then something seems like it might be right, and you try it. It might be, and it might not be right. But anyway, it's hard to, unless you enjoy doing it. And when I messed around with poetry for several years, and finally decided when my sons were 2 and 5 that I was going to actually work at it, because I'd had enough encouragement from some of my professors, and that made me feel like I was obligated to try, because I had some kind of a talent, and it might be that I could develop it, and I yearned for criticism. I wanted someone who was experienced and knew poetry to look at my work and tell me where it was weak and where it was strong. And I did find that. I found it in a correspondence course from the University of Washington in Seattle. By the way, where are you on the West Coast?
I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area, close to Berkeley.
Well, David Wagner, there was a school, Theodore Retke was at the University of Washington in Seattle, and they had a very good correspondence course. And I took every lesson that they had, every course in creative writing that I could. And that was a lot of poems. I wrote a lot of poems, because each course had 32 lessons. So it was hundreds of poems. And eventually, and he introduced me to other poets that were students, and also encouraged me to send poems to journals, literary journals at universities, and I could read poems that that had been selected by the editors of these journals, and make my own decisions about whether I wanted my poems to sound like theirs, or learn from the poems that other young poets were writing. So it's work. You have to want to do it. And one reason I wanted to do it was for my sons, so that they would, if they had talents that could be developed, they would know that it had been done, or that it was something to work at. And also because It's the only thing I ever really did that I didn't get bored with. I never got bored with it. And so I think to look for those kinds of things when they're selecting some field that they think they have an interest in, and be sure to look for criticism from someone whose opinion you value. I mean, your mom is always going to tell you, oh, yeah, this is great, But you have to have an objective reader. It has to be, somebody who partially understands what it is you're trying to do. And I had a couple of people that helped me a great deal that way. They didn't try to make me write like they were writing. They tried to understand what I was wanting to do and telling me what worked and what didn't work. That's what a coach does for an athlete. You've got to do these exercises or you're never going to be able to leap over that goal or something. And he knows that because he's been involved in the sport. Your coach. He knows what works and what doesn't work. How you're going to tackle that guy the right way or you're going to do it the wrong way, and it won't work. So, same thing with writing. So anyway, those people are out there. There are more creative writing courses than there ever were in colleges and universities. I haven't taught since the 90s in universities, so I'm not sure exactly what is there now. But they were all taught by people who had published work and knew not only their own work, they knew the history of poetry and what had touched people and what had not touched people, and they knew how the history of poetry and English language. So anyway, you also don't want friends to look at your work because they're going to maybe want to compliment you and not be truthful about something that's not working. And so you have to get an objective person that's knowledgeable to help you and be determined that you want to succeed at it, and know that you're not going to, every poem you write is not going to be a home run. It doesn't work that way. The world doesn't work that way. You have to be ready for lots of rejections.
I was curious, let's say when you're in the outdoors and the poem about the mouse, for example, if there is a feeling that arises in your body first and words come to that, or if it's an instance of, well, I'll just ask that, is there a feeling in your body that gives rise to the words when you're writing?
When I'm outside, I pay a lot of attention to how I feel, what the body is doing, and so a lot of my choices of subjects come from that. Something will, all of a sudden I'm really struck by some image out there. If it's a tree against the sky, or it's a bird flying over. Yesterday, we've had owls, great horned owls, in the trees behind our house. And one of them flew very close to the window, by the window. Maybe that'll appear somewhere, but it was startling, because that's a big bird. And the funny thing is, the crow's trying to get rid of this bird, this owl. And they're out there yelling, and the crows shouting and cawing, and the great horned owl can just sit right in with the trunk of the tree behind him, and it's really hard to spot him up there because he's the exact same color as the trunk of and the same mottled color as the trunk of the tree. Anyway, being outdoors to me and watching what's going on is very uplifting. It sustains me because everything out there is saying yes to life. Nothing gives up till the last minute, the last drop of ice on the leaf. And that to me is energizing and beautiful. And so usually that's how I get started. And then I do come in and I have a lot of field guides, and the poets were not taking advantage of these field guides, which are new vocabularies from beginning to end, from cover to cover. All the flowers, all the parts of the flowers, all the insects, all the beetles, everything. And some of the little, I like the Ottoman field guides because they have a little paragraph with the kind of scientific detail of the creature, about the habits of the creature, and then some of them are very lyrical and just like a little succinct piece of prose. And so if I've seen this owl, and I could probably find out some things about its habits that I didn't know, and I like that. And it's always interesting to me. It's just interesting. And I have this, I don't know, have a lot of books about animals. And the thing I like is being astonished over and over and over. I mean, you can't. I went with some writers to a university, and we were to meet with people in the zoology department and biology, and go to their classes and talk about writing and with them and find out what they were doing. And I was assigned to a scientist who studies mushrooms. And I thought, oh brother, this is not going to be very exciting. And she was taking her students out into a little piece of, I think it was a vacant lot actually. And I thought, oh well. Oh my gosh, those students were so excited. And they had their little baskets, and I found out that things I had never called mushrooms were mushrooms. And then this one boy came rushing back. They all came rushing back. Look what so-and-so has found. Look at this. Where'd this come from? And she said, Jiminy crickets. And she had to follow them out there, and they were all so excited. I got into the whole thing too. And lo and behold, I found a book. It may have been there, or I may have ordered it. A great big book, a great big thick book of mushrooms of North America. Yeah, mushrooms of North America. And here are all these things. And so the closer you look, it's like Blake's heaven in a grain of salt or something, grain of sand. What is it he says? I don't know if it's heaven, but a universe in a grain of sand. The more you look at it, the more it multiplies. So it was an experience. I've had many of them like that, thinking, oh, well, just a dandelion. No, not just a dandelion. Anyway, it's not just a mushroom. We've got all kinds of mushrooms. And of course, these naturalists name everything. They name everything. So they name all the kinds of clouds that are up in the sky, and they give them all names. And of course, the stars all give them all names. And when the Europeans were entering this hemisphere, they were seeing lots and lots of animals and plants and things that they'd never seen before. And they're gathering those up and sending them back to England to be, housed and classified and named. And I don't know. It's just, I don't know. I like it. It just lifts me up. It lifts me up to see people enjoying the natural world. I guess you call it the natural world. We're part of it. Like we weren't. People say that like we're not part of it, and of course we are.
Mm-hmm. Well, if a person wanted to learn more about your work, I know I had mentioned to you that I really have only been exposed to a sliver of your work. People who are listening to this podcast that have a particular interest in the spiritual path, is there one of your books that you would recommend over others, or do you think that all would be a good entry point?
Well, there are poems in all of my books that I like more than others, and I have a book that is my collected as of 2001. It was all the poems in all of my books published up till that time, and I have published, I don't know, maybe 5 since then that are not included in that book. Then I have that book is called Song of the World Becoming. And I don't know how many copies of that are left. Somebody said there were copies on Amazon, but it's a hardcover book and it's a fairly large book. Then there is another book that is called Firekeeper. It's one word, Firekeeper, and it was published in, well, I forgot what year it was published. I think 2005 or something like that. Yeah, 2005. And it's selected poems up until 2005, selected poems from all of my books, not the whole books, but selected poems from each book up through 2005. And that would mean the last 2 books do not have any poems from them in this book. But that's a pretty good selection, and it's a paperback, and it's fairly small, because not small, too small, but it was they published this because people could carry it in a backpack easily. And that's the kind of a book that they wanted to do. So I had a Firekeeper published earlier than this that didn't cover as many books, and it was a larger book. So this is called Firekeeper Selected Poems Revised and Expanded, because we revised the older Firekeeper and took some of the poems out of that, and in order to get in the newer books.
Mm-hmm.
So those two, if they want a selection, Firekeeper is best. And there are other books. I think my book just prior to this new one, it's called Holy Heathen Rhapsody.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's maybe simpler if they just want a little bit. This Firekeeper has got a lot of poems in it, and that book, Holy Heathen Rhapsody, may be simpler to begin with.
Good, well, thank you. And do you have a website at all?
No, I wish I did. I did have one. That's one fault of mine, weakness actually, is that I haven't done enough really to promote my books. I did a lot of readings through the 90s, but I don't know, you let up on that, and it's kind of like swimming upstream. You stop swimming, you're right back where you started. And so anyway,
I understand. I have done bits of marketing for various endeavors, and yes, as soon as you stop applying the energy, it just evaporates.
I want the work to be known. I don't care myself personally to be known,
Right.
but I do want the work. I want it considered. That's what I want. I want it to be considered. And anyway, I've been luckier than I deserved, I think, given the kind of effort I put forth in that area. So I thank you very much.
Well, you're welcome, and I thank you for taking all this time. I appreciate you taking time out of your day for this.
Well, I appreciate your doing it. I'm sure that it's going to be a lot of work for you to put this all together, and I appreciate that, and thank you for it.